All right, how are y'all doing? Good, right? We're trucking through here. So how's homework number 3 going? Maybe working on it, kind of. So I think I said that it's due at midnight. Honestly, if you want to bring it in tomorrow morning at 9, I'm not going to grade it at midnight. So if you just want to bring in a physical copy tomorrow when you take your exam, yeah, that's fine. So anyway, if you want to if you have any questions about it or run into any problems, you can send me an email. We can talk a little bit about it this afternoon. Okay. Remember, tomorrow we're taking the exam. Just so everybody knows what's going on, what's on our exam. So let's see if I can remember here myself. Chapters 9 and 10 on banks. Chapter 12 on banking crises. My reading on sovereign debt crises. And then chapters 13 and 14 on monetary policy in the Fed. Okay, I think that's it. And then, of course, all the additional readings and things that were also assigned. Oh, I'm not going to ask you a question about econometrics, but I might on the final, okay? Or on the last exam. So there won't be any questions on econometrics related to this, okay? So that will just be possibly fair game on your last exam. So, as I said, the format is going to be exactly the same. 80 points of kind of short answers, definitions, shorter problems with multiple parts at places. And then there's going to be a 20-point current event essay, right? That's going to picking out some current event and ask you to write about it and do some analysis. I mean, in some ways, I think there's less material on this exam than there was on the first exam. So I think hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. There's not really a ton of graphs on this exam, quite honestly. Maybe even fewer problems, right? So I think there's more, just kind of a lot more analysis and kind of institutional stuff on this second exam than there was on the first exam. So a lot of readings, a lot of kind of factual information, but less kind of problem sort of material. Yeah.
Are there going to be definitions again?
Sure. Yeah, there always are, right? Yeah. So anyway, this afternoon we'll have a little bit of time if you want to ask some specific questions about things, but I thought we'd just spend here a minute or two just talking about the exam in general, what the setup is. But, honestly, I think, you won't be surprised by the setup of this one. It's going to be a lot like the first one, right? So hopefully you know a lot more what's coming, which would be good. So, okay, well, then let's jump into chapter 15. What we talk about today will not be on the exam tomorrow, okay? That said, I think a lot of the things that we talk about today will touch on things that are going to be on the exam. So I guess in some sense, we'll get a little bit of review in here. And then obviously this will be an important part of the last exam that we have. So chapter 15 is about the tools of monetary policy. Okay. So when it comes to monetary policy, you have to think about it this way. The Fed has tools that they use to try to hit targets. And the targets then help them hit their goals, okay? So tools to targets to goals. The Fed has tools that helps them hit targets, that helps them hit goals, okay? So I think the analogy, probably the best analogy that I can come up with, even if you are not golfers, hopefully you can understand this analogy. But suppose that you are standing, you have a par 5 hole, right? So 5 shots is the average that's going to take you to get the ball in the hole. So what do you want to do when you stand on the tee? You want to just like peer out there and look at the flag and say, okay, I'm going right for it? No, right? You have to think about, well, where do I want my first shot? Where do I need my second shot to be? So this sets me up for my third and fourth shots, right? So when you stand on the tee, you don't really want to think about, well, what do I have to do to get the ball in the hole? That's too far away. What you want to think about is you probably first want to think about, well, to get to my goal, I need to pick a target that I can actually hit, right? So you might say, I would like the ball to be on the fairway, and maybe on the right side of the fairway, I'm going to aim for that tree, okay? That would be your target. And then the tool is, well, what club should I pick, right? And so the Fed has to kind of think about monetary policy in the same way. They just can't say, I want fast growth and low inflation, right? Because they don't actually directly control those things. Those things are multiple steps away. So what they have to think about is they have to think about what targets they're going to pick more on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And then they have to think about, well, what's the appropriate tool to get us to this target? Okay? The Fed really has 3 tools. In some sense, they have more, but they have 3 basic tools. They can use open market operations. They can use discount loans. Or they can change the required reserve ratio. We talked about all 3 of these things yesterday. The first 2 is a way of changing the monetary base. These are ways that the Fed can change the monetary base. This changes the multiplier. So these are the 3 tools that the Fed has to work with, right? Doing open market operations, discount loans, which change the monetary base, or they can change the reserve requirement ratio, which changes the money multiplier, right? How about targets? Well, in theory, the Fed could pick a lot of different targets. And in fact, over time, the Fed has picked many different types of targets. The Fed has targeted the money supply. The Fed has targeted different interest rates. The Fed has targeted a lot of different things. But today, what the Fed chooses to target is the federal funds rate. Right, we'll call it the FFR, the federal funds rate. This is, I guess, what you could think of as the day-to-day target that for the Federal Reserve. This is one of the things that the Fed pays attention to more than day to day, minute to minute, right? The Fed is really trying to hit this target. And so let's talk about what this is and how the Fed actually does this, okay? What is the federal funds rate again? In fact, I know you know this.
Yeah, we figure out which banks will lend to each other.
Right. Right, so the federal funds market is basically interbank lending. Okay, it's a market for lending between banks. It's based on the supply and demand of bank reserves. Right, so this responds to the amount of bank reserves that are in the banking system. This is just one interest rate. But having said that, when the federal funds rate changes, what happens to other interest rates? They tend to change as well, right? So the federal funds rate impacts all other interest rates. It is in many ways a benchmark. Now, it's going to impact other interest rates to a greater or lesser extent, quite honestly. It's probably going to impact short-term interest rates more than long-term interest rates. Usually, but not always. But usually it has a bigger impact on short-term interest rates. But it will impact long-term interest rates as well. Probably not to such a great extent. So let's talk about how this federal funds market works. And this is really just an application of supply and demand. However, there's some things that are unique about the federal funds market that make this a little bit more complicated. Okay, so here's our federal funds market. What creates demand for reserves in this federal funds market? Banks that need to borrow, right? Why would they need to borrow? To meet required reserves, right? That's the big one, required reserves. And possibly they might also want some excess reserves. Banks really borrow so that they can meet their required reserves and their excess reserves. So basically banks at the end of the day have to meet their required reserves. So one of the things that banks do, I think it's like at 6 o'clock every evening, banks have to be meeting their required reserves. So every bank at a little bit before 6 o'clock calculates its amounts of deposits, looks at its required reserve ratio, figures out what its required reserves are. And if it doesn't have that much at the Fed, it needs to do something. It needs to borrow. And the easiest way to borrow is to borrow from another bank, right? Well, some banks are going to be short of required reserves. Other banks are probably going to have some excess reserves, okay? And so that's who they borrow from, right? That's who they borrow from. Now, there is something interesting, though, about this demand for required reserves, in that it cuts off. It cuts off at the interest rate that the Fed pays for excess reserves. And I'm going to explain that here in a minute. What about the supply for reserves? Well, this is determined by banks that lend. Mainly their excess reserves. However, ultimately, this is set by the Fed. The Fed is really the ultimate determinant of the supply of reserves in the banking system. Once again, here, there's a cutoff, though. The interest rate on discount loans. And I'm putting a question mark here because it's often not clear to me that this is, in fact, the cutoff. Your author argues that it's a cutoff, but I'm not so sure that it is. Okay. So I think the easiest way to understand this is really just to look at the graph. And then let's try to talk through this. As I said, this is, it's a straight application of supply and demand, but there's some funky things that are going on here. Okay, so here's our federal funds market. So what does demand look like? Demand is downward sloping. Here's the federal funds interest rate. Demand is downward sloping, except it has this weird cutoff. At the interest rate that the Fed pays on excess reserves. And once again, why is this? Just think about it this way. Can a bank borrow money at less than the interest rate that the Fed pays on excess reserves? No, because why would another bank lend you an interest rate at less than what the Fed pays on excess reserves, right? A bank is not going to want to lend you less than that because they can just keep the money risk-free at the Fed for this price. So this is kind of a floor, right? By charging an interest or by paying interest rates on excess reserves, the Fed in some sense has created a floor for what the federal funds rate is. Likewise, so that's the demand, right? That's the demand curve. Likewise, what does the supply look like? The supply is set by the Fed, except that in theory, there's a ceiling. And that ceiling is the discount rate. Would a bank ever pay more than the discount rate for a loan? Well, your author's argument is that why would a bank borrow from another bank at more than the discount rate when they can just borrow from the Fed at the discount rate? That's your author's argument. So in reality, I can actually think of some reasons why a bank might want to pay more than the discount rate, right? You may not want to borrow from the Fed because the Fed's the regulator, right? You don't want to like raise red flags by borrowing money from the Fed. And so to me, it's not completely clear that this discount rate really is a ceiling. But, you know, this is your author's argument. And so you notice here that it looks like it's supply and demand. And here's our equilibrium federal funds rate. But it has these weird cutoffs at a floor and a ceiling. Right? So here you have the discount rate, which essentially acts as a ceiling, and then the interest rate on excess reserves that acts like a floor. Okay, so let's, now that we've kind of worked this out, how do the Fed's three tools impact the federal funds rate? How do the Fed's three tools impact the federal funds rate? So let's talk about these three tools. Our first one is open market operations. Okay, and let's think about an example where the Fed conducts an open market purchase. Okay. Okay, so here's our federal funds market. So what happens? What happens here if the Fed conducts an open market purchase? What happens to the supply of reserves? Goes up, right? An open market purchase means the Fed increases the monetary base. Some of that is likely to be in reserves. We don't know exactly how much because as we talked about yesterday, some of it could be an increase in currency too. But most likely it's going to increase reserves to some extent. So how do reserves change? Using my big marker, so powerful. Right? This moves in that direction. And what happens to the federal funds rate? The federal funds rate goes down. The federal funds rate goes down. When the Fed conducts open market purchases and increases the monetary base, what pressure does that put on interest rates? It lowers interest rates. Okay? And when it lowers the federal funds rate, what's it going to do to other interest rates? Put downward pressure on that as well. Right? So when you hear about monetary policy, everybody talks about monetary policy in terms of interest rates, okay? But in many ways, you're talking about the target of monetary policy. Nobody talks about the tools of monetary policy. In other words, how exactly does the Fed push down interest rates? Well, through open market operations is one way, and the most common way. Note though, is there a limit to how much this works? Right. This only works as long as the federal funds rate is greater than that interest rate the Fed pays on excess reserves. They can only push it down so far. because there is a floor here. And it's a floor that the Fed has created. Okay, a decrease in the discount rate. What impact is this going to have? So how do we graph a reduction in the discount rate? Well, this is really just reducing the ceiling, right? If the Fed reduces the discount rate, you're really just reducing the ceiling. Is this going to change the federal funds rate, though? Not unless you push it below what the current federal funds rate is. So this is unlikely to have much effect unless the Fed, for whatever reason, would push the discount rate below the federal funds rate. As a practical matter, the Fed does not do this. The Fed doesn't want banks borrowing from them. The Fed would prefer banks to borrow from other banks, okay? And this is just simply a reflection of the fact that the Fed doesn't want to be, let me back up. The Fed wants to be the lender of last resort. They do not want to be the lender of first resort, okay? So they would prefer banks to borrow money from each other. They would prefer banks to borrow money from each other and kind of leave the Fed out of it in most cases. Okay. Let's talk about the third tool. So let's talk about an example in which the Fed cut the required reserve ratio. Okay. What happens here? The Fed cuts the required reserves. What does this do? Yeah. It would change the amount of excess reserves, right? So it would definitely create a lot more excess reserves and reduce the demand for required reserves, which I think is the big effect. This is essentially a reduction in demand, right? And so what would happen to our demand curve? It would essentially shift to the left. And what would happen to the federal funds rate? It would go down. This makes sense because what happens to the money supply? The money supply goes up. If the Fed cuts the required reserve ratio, we know the multiplier goes up and the money supply goes up. When the money supply goes up, interest rates should go down. All right? So this makes sense, right? This makes sense. This is consistent with what we talked about yesterday. So these are the three tools that the Fed uses, and this is how these three tools impact interest rates. And so once again, while monetary policy in the news is usually couched in terms of interest rates, the interest rate is not really the tool that the Fed uses, right? The Fed really has to use these other three tools. Let's talk a little bit about why the Fed has chosen to pay interest rates on excess reserves. Okay, we had an article that you read for yesterday about this, right? And the thing is, a lot of people in Congress were quite upset because this could cost the Fed up to $50 billion a year. That's not a small chunk of change. That's actually quite a bit of money, right? Quite a bit of money. And so many people in the Fed, or I'm sorry, many people in Congress were like, why in the world is the Fed choosing to pay interest rates? They don't have to. They could, they could do what they've done, for most of US history, which is not pay interest rates. And so the Fed's thinking is really a three-pronged approach, okay? And granted, these are pretty technical reasons, and this is one of the reasons why I don't think a lot of members in Congress have really quite understood this, because they don't understand the details of monetary policy. The first is, the Fed would like to have a ceiling and a floor for the federal funds rate. So if you go back to this graph here, or graph like this, one of the things the Fed has done now is notice there's kind of a limit to how much the federal funds rate can fluctuate. It can only fluctuate between the difference between the discount rate and the rate that it pays on excess reserves. It's a narrow band. And so the Fed argues this gives them more control. This gives them more control. For the same reason, when the Fed began paying interest rates on excess reserves, it increased the amount of excess reserves. And that significantly reduced the multiplier. The Fed prefers low and stable multiplier. They feel like it increases their control over the money supply. And so the Fed feels like this is a good thing because the money supply now is not going to veer as widely as it used to. So the first two here are really about control, right? The Fed actually thinks that paying interest rates on excess reserves gives them more control over the things they care about, gives them more control over the money supply, gives them more control over the federal funds rate. And then the third reason, and I think this third one is as important as the first two. The Fed thinks that it makes the financial system more stable by increasing the liquidity in the system. Okay, what do you imagine was true before the Fed paid interest rates on excess reserves? No one kept excess reserves, right? Banks that had even little bit of excess reserves would pull them out and put them in something else, sometimes out of the country. So what this did is this led to actually relatively little liquidity. The whole system was kind of always right on edge. Right? The banks tended to operate right at the margin. But of course, that gave them very few excess reserves. It might have been a very efficient system, but it wasn't a very stable system. And the Fed worried about how little liquidity there actually could be in the event of a crisis. Now, today, banks hold much more excess reserves, and you saw that in that article you read, right? There's a little graph, I won't flash it up, but there's been a dramatic increase in the amount of excess reserves that banks hold. So, so that's why the Fed's doing it. They actually think that it provides a more stable financial system if banks feel like they have the flexibility to hold some excess reserves, right? And aren't always trying to keep their excess reserves down to zero. So is that worth $50 billion a year? Well, geez, $50 billion is a lot of money, right? Trump said we're getting out of the WHO because it costs us too much money. The WHO costs us $500 million, to give you some idea. So this is about 100 times what we give to the WHO. Yeah, it's costly. On the flip side, the Fed says, oh, this pays for itself in some ways, because when the multiplier goes down, we can just increase the monetary base and pay for it that way. Yeah, I mean, this is the crazy world of monetary policy where 50 billion there and 50 billion there doesn't really add up to that much, right? So, yeah, this is an extremely technical argument, all right, extremely technical argument. But the Fed thinks that it makes sense, and so usually on these technical things, the Fed is usually pretty right? Because they got a whole bunch of economists thinking about these things. And so that, that's one big way that the Federal Reserve has changed its operations quite significantly. When I say pay interest rates on excess reserves, though, in this day and age, it's still at a very, very low interest rate. I think the Fed's paying 0.25%. So it is not a high interest rate by any means, but it is something, right? It is something. Let's talk about tell the Fed a little bit more about how this works in practice. Okay, so we've kind of talked about some of the theory here. Let's talk a little bit about the practice. All right, let's begin by talking about open market operations. How do they work in practice? Okay. Why does the Fed prefer to use open market operations? Why is this their preferred tool? Exactly. How long does it take you to buy and sell T-bills? You can do this almost instantaneously. It's fast. It's easy. It's flexible and precise. It's cheap. Right. The Fed pays very, very low margins on this. It's reversible. Basically, these are all whatever tool you use for whatever job, right? And let's say you're you're doing some work around your house, right? These would be the characteristics of any sort of tool, right? It's fast, it's easy, it's flexible, it's precise, it's cheap, it's reversible. If you screw it up, you can, redo it. I mean, it's hard to beat open market operations, right? It's hard to beat open market operations. They're very, very simple for the Fed, and they have a lot of experience doing this. So these open market operations take place in New York at the New York Fed. For those of you who've been to New York, you've been to Wall Street. When you go to the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street, right across the street from the New York Stock Exchange is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. And so that's where these operations are managed on a day-to-day basis, right? Now, on a day-to-day basis, there's really kind of two types of open market operations that the Fed does. One is what they call a dynamic. And the other is a defensive. Okay, let me explain the difference here. A dynamic is intended to permanently change the monetary base. And this is when the Fed conducts an outright sale or purchase of securities. A defensive is when they try to temporarily change the monetary base. And they typically do this through repos, right? If you remember what a repo is, a repurchase agreement. I think we've talked about this a couple of times in some of your articles. Repos have shown up. What's a repo? Do you remember what a repo is?
Like the sale of an asset would be to purchase it back.
Exactly. It is basically a temporary sale, right? So the Fed could sell T-bills for 3 days with the agreement that in 3 days we will buy them back at this price. So it's a temporary change as opposed to a permanent change, okay? So you can probably guess, if the Fed's doing a lot of dynamic open market operations. When do you think the Fed does a lot of dynamic open market operations? Now, what makes you say now?
During like the recession.
Yeah, I don't know if literally now they're doing it. When would they have done a lot of dynamic? Right when they change policy, right? These are associated with a change in policy. So when the Fed changes its policy, for instance, when the Federal Open Market Committee meets and says we're lowering interest rates, you can bet that the Fed's going to be doing dynamic open market operations. Defensive open market operations is not when there's a change in policy. You're just maintaining that policy. You're managing that policy on a day-to-day basis. Okay. So when the people at the Federal Reserve make decisions, I mean, they are looking at a ton of information, right? They are looking at, cash flows and liquidity data. They are looking at things like the weather, right? Strangely enough, bad weather will slow down transactions, right? Sometimes you'll have, for any number of reasons, you could be having unpredictable changes in liquidity and unpredictable changes in how much currency people are holding or how much reserves banks are holding. And so what the Fed is trying to do is they're trying to smooth this out. Right? They're trying to smooth it out. And most importantly, they're trying to maintain the current federal funds rate at its target. So whatever that target is, they're trying to keep the federal funds rate there. To do that, they've got to move around the monetary base a little bit. As opposed to a change in a dynamic, when there's a change in what that target is. So when there's a change in what the target is, that's when the Fed's much more likely to do dynamic operations. And so this is complicated stuff, right? Really the details of how the Fed decides to do defensive open market operations is fairly complex, but it's not uncommon. If you look at what the Fed does on a day-to-day basis, it almost appears random. And to some extent, it is somewhat random because it's often responding to random occurrences, right? So you see the Fed would purchase, sell, purchase, sell, purchase, sell, right? It's just kind of all over the place. What that tells you is that they're just doing the defensive open market operations, right? They're just doing that based on whatever's going on in the economy, wherever they see a sticking point, they will jump in to try to keep that federal funds rate constant. Okay. So by and large, that's how the Fed controls the money supply. The Fed really never uses the other tools that they have, right? The other tools of the discount, changing the discount rate and changing the reserve requirement ratio. Having said the Fed doesn't use those, let's talk about them for a minute. In practice, the Fed could change its discount lending in two ways. It could change the discount rate or it could just change its loan standards, saying we're going to make it easier for people to qualify for a loan. There's three types of loans that the Fed, in theory, can give out. One isn't, we haven't really talked about this, but the Fed does do some seasonal lending. This is really to small banks. The Fed gives small banks a little bit of credit during certain times of the year. So, for instance, in Iowa, a lot of small Iowa banks are recipients of this, because what tends to be true about Iowa banks? Well, this is an agricultural state, right? And so what do most farmers do? Most farmers borrow in the spring and they pay back their loans in the fall. So banks find that they have more need for liquidity in the spring and they have less need of liquidity in the fall. So oftentimes the Fed will give them temporary loans, right, that kind of smooth out this seasonal stuff. To be honest with you, though, this is in the big picture, this is not important, right? The Fed doesn't really use this to change the monetary base because these are small loans. And they often, whatever they do here, they offset over here with open market operations. So the Fed is really doing this to help small banks. The more common type is adjustment credit. This is the banks with short-term liquidity problems. Is the Fed in the business of lending to banks that are insolvent? No, by law, they cannot do that. So if a bank is bankrupt, the Fed cannot lend to them by law. That's where the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation gets in and wraps up the bank and all that. So that if the first thing that the Fed has to do before they make these kind of loans is they have to judge whether the bank is actually in trouble long term or whether there's just some sort of short term thing. And really, that's it. That's it. The Fed used to do other types of lending, right? Such as adjustment, what they called an extended credit, where the Fed would lend money to a bank to help facilitate a merger. But after Dodd-Frank, the Fed really is not allowed to do any of that stuff anymore. So really, this is it. This is it. You can get a short-term loan from the Fed. When I say short-term, these are usually like overnight, right? You can keep on rolling them over for a period of time, but these are very short-term loans. Or you can get a little bit longer loan, but these are just small potato things, right? These are not really for in terms of crisis. So, yeah, the Fed this is just not the way that the Fed does it anymore, right? And why? What's the potential big downfall of this, of the Fed getting too much into the business of lending banks loans? Well, what happens if the banks come to expect that the Fed will always lend them money without asking too many questions? Moral hazard, right? And so the Fed just does not want to be in the business of banks relying upon them for loans. And as a result, it's not a good way to control the money supply. So the Fed wants this to be available, but rare. And that's basically what it is. It's available, but it's very rare because the Fed does not want to be in the business of this. In the old days, let me say that the Fed did do this. right? So in the early days of the Fed used the discount lending as a way of controlling the monetary policy. And it didn't work very well. It did not work very well, in part because there was a moral hazard problem. Well, we won't get into all the reasons it didn't work very well, but we'll just say it didn't work very well. And then there's the required reserve ratio, which is the other tool that the Fed could use to control the money supply. So when the Fed changes the required reserve ratio, it increases the amount of excess reserves, but it also changes the multiplier. Okay. So it really changes the reserves in the banks in two ways, right? The Fed sets this. Okay, so the Fed sets this within limits imposed by Congress. I should have checked this, what this is today, but I think this is reasonably close. This was, I think, as of last year. It might have changed this year, but the last time I checked, what's the required reserve? It's 0% on the first $15 million in deposits. And then 3% on 15 million to 115 million. And then it's 10% on 115 million plus. And for all practical purposes, the Fed can vary this. I put 14% here, but I meant to put 18%. The Fed can vary this between 8% and 18%. So a couple of things about this. First off, as I said yesterday, calling the reserve requirement ratio of 10% is pretty accurate, right? That's what it is for most banks. But do notice, for smaller banks, you don't have to pay as big a required reserve ratio. So once again, this is kind of like a little break that the Fed gives to small banks, is they don't have to hold quite as much excess reserves. Okay, the Fed never uses this. Why? Why doesn't the Fed use this? True, right. So if the Fed was always changing this around on a day-to-day basis, who would hate that? Banks would, because this would be really costly to them. Right? The banks manage these required reserves very carefully. And so if they always had to be changing their target, it would be very costly to banks. And it would be inefficient. We like banks to be able to plan for the future. Banks need to plan for the future, right? Remember what banks do. They borrow short and lend long. They need to plan for the future. And so this is just in the interest of efficiency, not a really good idea. The other big problem is it's likely to lead to big changes in the money supply and monetary base. And if you don't believe me, just play around with the numbers. Yesterday we calculated the formula for the money multiplier, right? Play around with those numbers, right? When you play around with the numbers, you'll see that even a small change in the required reserve ratio can lead to a pretty big change in the money multiplier. And so remember, the Fed in general, doesn't like to do big dramatic things. They're a bunch of bankers. The Fed is fairly conservative, right? They would prefer to do a lot of small changes as opposed to a few big changes. And so in general, the reserve requirement ratio is just not a good thing to do, right? The trend across countries and I think the Fed feels the pressure. There is, though, a trend across most countries to reduce this reserve requirement ratio. Why? Because this reserve requirement ratio is essentially a tax on banks. And so the argument is banks will be more efficient if they don't have to hold as many required reserves. Of course, what's the counter argument? Well, what's always the trade-off in finance? Yes, this is probably going to make banks more profitable, but what does it also make them?
More risky.
More risky. And so banks have been lobbying hard to cut this reserve requirement ratio. Lobbying very hard to cut this reserve requirement ratio. And, we'll see. We'll see. So far, the Fed has been pretty reluctant to do this. But as other countries cut the reserve requirement ratio, it does put more pressure on the US to kind of keep up, right? And so you can, in this sense, keeping up, you might think about this as a race to the bottom, right? There might be a race to the bottom here, that every other country cuts the reserve requirement ratio. It might force the US to cut the reserve requirement ratio, even if that doesn't make a lot more sense. Okay, we've talked about this before, but let's spend just a little bit more time talking about other tools that the Fed can use. And here I'm using tools with quotation marks to say these aren't really tools, but they are ways that the Fed can try to achieve their goals, right? Basically, other avenues that the Fed has to leverage. Okay, we've talked about that the Fed has, instead of always buying T-bills, they have been buying different types of securities. And these are essentially new lending programs. When the Fed buys these securities, they are lending to the market, right? In 2008, the Fed bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and T-bonds. In 20, what have they been buying? commercial paper. And they've been essentially providing backup or insuring small business loans. This is, do any of you have parents who own a small business or know people who have them? Maybe your parents engaged in this PPP program, right? But you probably know somebody. And the PPP program was basically loans. Banks made loans to individuals. And where did that money come from? It came from the Fed, right? And the Fed essentially was, in some sense, insuring these loans, meaning if they don't get paid back, the bank is not going to suffer the loss, right? So this was a really nice program for small businesses because many of these loans probably don't have to be paid back, right? If you didn't cut workers or if you met many conditions, you usually don't have to pay those back. In which case, it's not going to be the Fed that takes the loss, it's going to be the Treasury that takes the loss, right? So I don't know if you should call it a loss because it's really more of a grant than a loan. I'm not going to get into all the details. I don't know why I'm getting into the details now. Other than to say that the Fed has engaged in different ways of lending, right? Different ways of lending. And these asset purchase programs have, have been very extensive. In 2008, the Fed tripled the size of its balance sheet. Actually, probably triple is too low. Well, let's say quadrupled. If you extend it into 2009. What other institution could quadruple the size of their balance sheet in a year and a half? Nobody else, and certainly nobody during a recession, right? Only the Fed can do this because they have the ability to create new liabilities. So the Fed created a lot of new liabilities by creating new reserves and new currency. And what did they do with those new reserves and new currency? They bought a bunch of this stuff, right? They bought a bunch of mortgage-backed securities and treasury bills. So that's, that's been an important new tool that the Fed has used, and they've been using a lot of this. A lot of this in 2008. The Fed has more and more been focused on not bailing out individual banks. They've been trying to bail out markets. Why? Because one of the things the Fed has increasingly understood is bailing out individual banks is a losing game during a broad crisis, not a broad crisis, a broad crisis. Okay, why is it a losing game? Well, this is the trap the Fed almost fell into in 2008. Okay, the crisis is happening. Everything's panicking. Everyone's panicking. One bank gets into trouble. The Fed gives them a loan. What's the problem? Well, then another bank gets into trouble. So the Fed gives them a loan. And then another bank gets into trouble. The Fed gives them a loan. But then the first bank that they gave to a loan What's happened to that bank when people see other banks get into trouble? Well, now this bank is in more trouble, so I got to go back and give them another loan. It's almost like you're playing catch up, right? It's like there's too many balls up in the air. Trying to bail out individual banks is not going to help. Why? Because liquidity is a market concept. I'll explain what I mean by this here in a minute, but this is really an important point. Liquidity cannot be maintained at the individual level, particularly if you're a bank. Is a bank ever going to have enough cash on hand to pay back its depositors? Never. What's the only way that a bank is going to protect its liquidity? First, through confidence, and second, through its ability to sell some of its assets. And so that's what I mean by liquidity as a market concept. If the market crashes, nobody has any liquidity because nobody can sell anything. So I think the Fed has increasingly seen this as, if I want banks to have liquidity, what I need to make sure is that markets are functioning. If markets are functioning, then banks can sell things and get liquidity, right? Or they can get a loan, right, from another bank or somewhere. But if markets don't function, then nobody has any liquidity. And so that, I think, and particularly you see this in 2020, where the Fed has been very, very concerned about what's happening in market liquidity, right? This is why the Fed has in these commercial paper markets, where lots of businesses borrow short term. And the Fed noticed that during early stages of this crisis, a lot of these bonds just simply weren't selling. Nobody was buying bonds. And so the Fed said, listen, if nobody can sell bonds, that's putting banks at risk. And so what we need to do is we need to create liquidity, right? Another market where the Fed has spent a lot of time intervening is this repo market for T-bills, right? The Fed doesn't just use the repo market. A lot of businesses use the repo market as a way of getting liquidity. And the Fed has intervened a lot in these repo markets to make sure that they're functioning so that if banks need liquidity, they can get it. So, does this look bad? Yeah, I mean, I guess this is kind of a recurring theme that we've talked about. A lot of the stuff that the Fed increasingly finds itself doing is different than what it did in the old days, right? And it is much more invasive in many ways in markets than it used to be. On the flip side, I mean, it's just hard to argue that the Fed can anymore serve as an effective lender of last resort, just lending to individual banks. Because the problem is everything is too connected. As we've talked about, commercial banks are tied to insurance, tied to investment banks, tied to bond markets, tied to stock markets, right? They're all tied together. And so you can't protect banks without protecting the market to some extent. And so, yeah, I agree. It does look bad. It does look bad when the Fed, to some extent, is always intervening in markets. But I don't know if the Fed doesn't intervene in markets, I don't think we're going to like the consequences of that either, right? And so it's just kind of the world that we find ourselves in. One final tool that the Fed has tried to use here is what's called forward guidance. And what this means is that increasingly, the Fed is being more and more clear about what their policy intentions are. They are trying to be more transparent and not just announcing what their policy for the next 6 weeks is going to be, but in some cases up to a year and a half or 2 years, right? So for instance, the Fed on their last Federal Open Market Committee meeting, or maybe it was one before, basically announced, and we'll actually take a look at this on Thursday. We'll read the Fed's last Federal Open Market Committee notes. But the Fed basically has announced that for the next 18 months, you can expect interest rates to be 0, right? The Fed had not been doing that before. The Fed kind of, they wanted to keep their they wanted to be flexible, right? So I'm going to tell you what interest rates are going to be for the next 6 weeks, but I'm not going to tell you much more than that. But now the Fed has been really kind of saying, this is what we expect to be doing over the next year or year and a half, trying to make their policy more transparent, but also trying to kind of stabilize psychology and expectations, right? Let markets know this is what we're going to be doing so you can plan on it, right? You can plan on it. And so this is not in any sense a new tool, right? It's just maybe a new way of doing business that the Fed hopes kind of makes them more powerful, makes them more effective at doing their business. So, this has been undoubtedly probably the greatest period of experimentation of the Fed in its history, right? Between 2008 and then some of the things that the Fed is doing today, a lot of experimentation, right? A lot of experimentation. And so has it all worked? No. I mean, the fact of the matter is the Fed still has, it has limits to how much it can do during the crisis, right? The Fed is always in danger of finding itself in a position where it's pushing on a string, where it's driven interest rates down to 0, it's increasing liquidity, and yet nobody's spending, nobody's borrowing, nobody's lending, right? That's always a possibility. But the Fed has consistently been experimental and tried different things. And a lot of it's worked. A lot of it hasn't worked, but they've at least tried different things. And so, so it's been a very, very interesting time. Okay, well, we're kind of at the end of class time, and we're gonna have to come back this afternoon anyway, so let's maybe just cut it off here a couple minutes early. This afternoon, I want to talk about the Digital Surge article. I probably won't say too much about this because I think most of you reading your summaries, I think most of you kind of got the gist of what this is talking about, but I want to connect it to what we talked about this morning a little bit. We'll talk a little bit about monetary policy in sub-Saharan Africa. And then if you have some questions for review for the exam, we'll talk about that, okay? All right, so I'll see you back here at 12:30.